Welcome to Biology My Passion. I am Soumya Harikrishna. We are now learning the chapter How do Organisms Reproduce. We already discussed the general introduction of reproduction, then types of asexual reproduction and also why sexual reproduction. Now we move on to sexual reproduction in flowering plants, followed by that in human beings. So when we talk about flowering plants, why are we focusing on that? Because angiosperms are the higher level of plants, or the highly evolved plants are the flowering plants. So flower is very important for a plant in the sense that flower is the reproductive organ of a plant. So what is the significance of flowers? They are the reproductive organ. What do you mean by that? That means the reproductive structures are present in a flower. So now we are dealing with sexual reproduction. So basically you keep in mind, sexual reproduction means two parents are involved. From both the parents, a specialized cell called gamete will come and they fuse to form a single cell called a zygote. Then the zygote will undergo multiplication to form the baby or the new individual. So the zygote is actually the first cell formed after fusion, that is called a fertilization. Okay, fertilization is the main event in sexual reproduction. So when we learn about these gametes, we should know which all parts produce these gametes in male part or the female part, right? So that's why flowers are important. So in flowering plants, flowers are the reproductive structures. Now when you look at a flower, actually flower has got different parts. So the parts of flower are arranged in circular manner called whorls. Okay, so the outermost whorl is called a calyx. So this part, the name of the word is not important for you, but this part is more important for you. Okay, but this for your understanding I am just telling the entire structure of the green. Suppose if you look at a hibiscus flower, the outermost, when the hibiscus flower is in the bud condition, there is a green color entirely covering it. Okay, so that's the outermost circular part or the whorl, that is called a calyx. So individually that is made up of units called sepals. Actually there are 5 sepals in hibiscus. So calyx is the entire structure. Individual units are called sepals. Okay. Now once the flower blooms, the colorful part is coming out. That is a second whorl. That inner to the calyx, the next whorl, that is called a corolla. Okay. So the corolla also has individual units called petals. You are all familiar with petals, right? Now inner to that comes the male reproductive part, that means the andrecium, and the individual units of andrecium is called stamen, and the innermost is the female part or the gynoecium, and it is made up of individual units called carpel or pistil. Okay, now this symbol, it denotes male and this symbol denotes female. So 4 parts are there: sepals, petals, stamens and carpels. Now out of these 2 are actually not directly involved in reproduction, because the gametes or the germ cells, the word is another name for gamete is germ cell, they are produced within these structures. So these are called non-essential whorls. Even if they are not there, a flower can survive or reproduce, but without these 2 they cannot. So what are the functions of this? Sepals actually protect the flower, especially during bud condition, whereas petals are colorful, so they naturally attract pollinators. Whereas andrecium, when we are coming to, you forget about the word andrecium, but you focus on the word stamen. Stamen is a male part of a flower and it has got 2 parts. It is made up of a filament and an anther. A long filament is there. At the tip of that there is a structure called an anther. Inside the anther there are pollen grains. So where are pollen grains present? Within the anther, which is a part of stamen, that is a male part of a flower. Now where is the male gamete present? It is inside the pollen grain. Okay. Now coming to female part, it is called a pistil or carpel. It also has got 3 parts. The pistil or carpel consists of a swollen basal part called a ovary. Then there is a long tubular structure called a style, and there is a disc-shaped flat structure on top called a stigma. So inside the swollen ovary, what is present? Ovules are present. Inside the ovules, female gamete will form. So female gamete is present within the ovule located inside the ovary. The same way male gametes are present inside the pollen grain located inside the anther. Understood? These two are the main parts involved in reproduction. So some flowers can have both the parts in them. For example, hibiscus, rose, sunflower, etc. They have male part, that is stamen and carpel, present in the same flower. Such flowers are called bisexual flowers. Bi means what? Two. Two sexes in the same flower. Whereas there are certain other flowers which have only one sex present in them. Either stamen is there or carpel. Suppose when we take the flower, it will have sepals, petals and stamens, no carpel. Another flower will have sepals, petals and carpel, no stamen. So male flower and female flower are separate. Such flowers are called unisexual flowers. Uni means what? One. So it's an important differentiating question for you. Differentiate between unisexual flowers and bisexual flowers. If a flower has both male and female parts in them or reproductive structures in them, that is called a bisexual flower. Example, hibiscus, rose, etc. Whereas if a flower has either stamen, that is male part, or carpel, female part, then that flower is called a unisexual flower. Example, papaya, watermelon, coconut, all these are examples. So now when we talk about the process of reproduction, I told since it is sexual reproduction, the main event is fertilization. Fertilization means what? The male gamete should fuse with the female gamete. So when they are fusing, the pollen grains have to come over this stigma. Then pollen grain will release the male gamete that should come and fuse with the female gamete present within the ovule. So initially, prior to fertilization, there should be transfer of this gametes. That is, pollen grains have to be transferred to the stigma. The stigma is the disc-shaped flat region where the pollen grains land. So that process is called a pollination. So what is pollination? The process of transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower is called a pollination. Okay. Now pollination can be two types. Sometimes the pollen grains from one flower falls on the stigma of the same flower. Then we can call it as self-pollination because its own pollen grain is falling on the stigma. So basically both the sperm and ovum, means the male gamete as well as female gamete, will have the same DNA or the genetic constitution. So there is not much variation happening there. Okay, so such kind of pollination is called a self-pollination. That is transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Now, second type is called a cross-pollination. That is, if the pollen grain of one flower falls on the stigma of another flower. The other flower can be in the same plant or in a different plant. Both the cases we call it as cross-pollination. So, if the pollen grains falls on the stigma of another flower of the same plant or another plant, then it is called a cross-pollination. So, pollination can be of two types, self-pollination and a cross-pollination. So, usually if it is self-pollination, agents are not required, but if it is cross-pollination, there may be the requirement of pollinating agents. They are called pollinators. So, the pollinating agents or pollinators can be non-living like wind or water, etc. or animals, mainly insects, can also do this function. Basically, bees are the most common pollinating agents. Now we will learn how to draw the longitudinal section of a flower. LS means longitudinal section or vertical section. So we will start with the carpel or the pistil. So it has got three parts: ovary, style and a stigma. Okay, now we will draw the stamen. From below you can show filament. This side also filament, and you can draw anther like this. Then what is the next part? We have our petals. Then comes the sepal. Then inside the ovary you can draw a few ovules. Okay. So now you can label this stigma, style, ovary. Together you can write it as carpel. This is ovule. Now we can mark anther, filament. Together you can mark stamen, petals, sepal. This is a stalk of a flower. It is called a pedicel. If you can remember, it's up to you. Now let us see how is fertilization happening in flowering plants. So we know that prior to fertilization, pollination should happen. So pollen grains fall on the stigma. So I have drawn here the enlarged view of this carpel or pistil. So here is the stigma, style and ovary. Ovary consists of an ovule. I have shown only a single ovule here. So first a pollen grain lands on the stigma, and then if it is the correct pollen grain, means the right pollen grain, it will grow down through the style. Style is a hollow tube through which there comes a tube down from the pollen grain. That tube is called a pollen tube. So the pollen tube contains two nuclei. They are called the male gametes of the plant. Okay. So these male gametes will come down through the tube. It will grow and enter into this ovule. This ovule has got female gamete here. So this male gamete will fuse with the female gamete and what will form? Zygote. So that is called a fertilization. But here one more fusion happens. It's for your understanding. Just learn that is the second male gamete will come and fuse with these two nuclei. So how many fertilization happening here? 2. So it is called a double fertilization. So in flowering plants, double fertilization happens. Sometimes you may come across this in certain extra questions, extra material if you read. That's why I told you, but otherwise you have to simply learn this. That is, pollen tube comes down through the style and reaches the ovule, which is located inside the ovary. Then the male gamete fuses with the female gamete to form zygote. This is called a fertilization. Now, when you are asked to write fertilization, you should write post-fertilization events also. That means what happens after fertilization. So zygote is formed, then the zygote will start multiplying to form the embryo. So the initial stage of a development of an individual is called an embryo. Zygote is a single cell. When it divides, we get multicellular structure called embryo. Then embryo will develop into the next individual. Okay. So meanwhile, what happens when the zygote is becoming embryo, this ovule will develop a tough or hard covering, and that will turn into the seed. So which part is turning into the seed? Ovule. Now meanwhile, this swollen ovary also will become more fleshy, and that is turning into the fruit. So it's very important. Zygote will develop into embryo. Meanwhile, ovule will develop into seed and ovary will develop into fruit. Then what happens to the rest of the parts? The style, the stigma, the stamen, the carpel and the pistil. Everything falls off. Wither and falls off. Now what do we want? Only the fruit and seed inside. Okay. So this is fertilization. Inside the seed, what is there? The growing embryo. Embryo is protected inside the seed. So once the seed germinates, what will come out? Two structures will come out. One structure will go down and form the root, that is called the radicle, whereas other structure will grow as a shoot, that is called the plumule. So this germination happens only during favorable conditions. So once favorable conditions are available, the embryo within the seed starts to develop. This process is called the germination. You can very well visualize germination if you soak some green gram or the moong dal and then you keep it for sprouting. So what you are seeing is nothing but the germination of that seed. So that's about the sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, please like, share and subscribe to my channel, Biology My Passion. Thank you so much for watching.